For today's class, we'll continue with JavaScript as we started in the previous class. And today's class will be having the contents of the class divided into four sections. So for the first section, we have JavaScript variables. Under this section, we'll get to know what a JavaScript variable is. We'll also get to know how to declare variables in JavaScript. And you can see that under that part of this section, we have the var keyword, the let keyword, and the const keywords. So these keywords are what we basically use to declare variables in JavaScript. And would also be seeing how each of these keywords actually work. Also, would have a quick demo on JavaScript variables. That's at the end of this section. So for the next section, we have JavaScript identifiers and rules. Under this section, we'll get to see what a JavaScript identifier is. We'll also have a quick look at examples of JavaScript identifiers in different scopes, and we'll also get to know the rules that are under the JavaScript identifiers, because these identifiers cannot be declared or defined anyhow. There are some specific rules you must follow when declaring JavaScript identifiers. Also, we'll get to see examples of valid and invalid identifiers. So by that, you would know that the valid identifiers here are the identifiers that are accepted by JavaScript. And for the invalid identifiers, they are the ones that are not acceptable in JavaScript. We'll also see those. And at the end of this section, we'll have a quick rundown on how the JavaScript identifiers work. Next, we have JavaScript and camel case. Now, the camel case is actually a style of declaring variables. So, under this section, we'll get to know what a camel case is. We'll get to know how to make use of the camel case, and we'll also see some few examples of variables that are being declared using the camel case. We'll also get to see other types of casing, because aside from the camel case, there are other types of casing out there, but particularly to JavaScript, camel casing is the most used by programmers. So it's the reason why we have to, we'll get to know about camel case more. And finally, in the last section, we'll get to see how the let, var, and const keywords work. So for this section, we would have two concepts, which the first concept is the scope, and the second concept is reassigning a new value. So we'll get to see how the let, the var, and the const keyword actually work in the scope concept. And you can see that within the scope concept, we have the block scope, the functional scope, and the global scope. So we would also see how these scopes applies to the keywords we have. And at the end of this section, we'll have a quick demo on how these scopes work with the variable keywords. So without wasting time, we have the first section, which is JavaScript variables. Now, what is a JavaScript variable? A JavaScript variable is a named container used for storing data of any type. So the variable basically is a name we create. It's something that we put out there. It doesn't exist on its own. We have to create it. And this thing we've created would actually be used to store different values or data of any type. Now, by type here, we mean it could be of a number type, it could be a string type, it could be a boolean, it could be an object. You know, different values have different types they actually associated with. But for the sake of this class, we'll be seeing data types in future classes and not now. And also, a JavaScript variable can also be defined as a label that is used to reference a value. So this actually means that when you create this name, which is the variable, and you assign it a value, if there is a situation where you need to call that value, you can always call that value through the variable name you created or you declared. So that's what actually happens here with JavaScript variables. Next, we have variable declaration in JavaScript. Now, in JavaScript, variables can be declared using any of the following. And as you can see, we have the var keyword which comes first. Next, we have the let keyword, and we also have the const keywords. Now, if you're going back to the very first item on the list, the var keyword, in brackets, it has something that describes it which says not really used. Now, what this means is that the var keyword isn't really used in today's programming, and that's because the var keyword is quite old, and most of the times nowadays, most programmers don't use it anymore. But this doesn't mean that it doesn't work, it still works. But then, for the sake of professional, ethics, you would mostly be making use of the let keyword and the const keyword when declaring variables. But also in this class, we'll also get to know what the var keyword actually does and how it works. Now, the last item on the list has nothing, which means that you can actually declare the variable without a keyword, without nothing attached to it. But this would also mean that the variable would be undeclared, and we'll see how that unfolds when we get to the practical section of this class. So a quick thing to note here is that in JavaScript, a variable can be declared with or without a value. So what this basically means is that when you create this variable name, you can assign it a value at the initial point of creation, or you can just declare it and later on you assign it a value. That's actually left to you, but either ways it's okay. And something to note here also is that if a variable is declared with a value, the value would actually possess a specific data type. So this means that if you were to create a variable name and you assigned it a probably a number like 2022, now that 2022 actually has a specific data type. You can also assign to that variable name a string of text, which could just be any text that you like. And for the string, it must always be in quotes. That particular thing you've assigned to that variable is already already has a data type of its own. So all the values that can be assigned to a variable name have different data types they are under. So we'll be seeing that in future classes, but not yet. Now, assigning a value to a variable name is actually known as variable initialization. So what this means is that when you actually declare a variable without assigning it a value, you only declare the variable without an initialization. So no need to worry about this. I will explain it better in the next slide. Another thing to note under variable is the fact that if a variable is declared without a value, the value becomes the default of undefined. So the moment a variable name is declared and it hasn't been assigned a value, it's going to possess a value of undefined, which is not going to appear on the screen or on VS Code, but by default is the value it holds in as much as you did not assign a value to that variable name. So for the first keyword, we have the var keyword, which as we all know, it isn't really used anymore. But here you can see that the var keyword is among the keywords used for declaring variables in JavaScript. And you can see the syntax which is below the screen. It begins with the var, the var keyword. So after the var keyword, it is followed by the variable name which you would create yourself. And so the very first syntax on the screen is actually a syntax for just declaration. So if you were to declare a variable using the var keyword, you would have it to be in this form. Below it is another syntax which is assigned a value. So the second syntax actually describes the variable declaration and initialization. So you can see that there's a difference between the two syntax. The first syntax is just for variable declaration. So what that means is that you just declared that particular variable name with the keyword of var. You only just declare the variable. But the second one is variable declaration and initialization, which is assigning the variable name a particular value. So we'll be seeing an example of this in the next slide. So here we have a quick example of the var keyword, and you can see that the JavaScript codes are within the script tags. Also, for the first line of code, we have it to begin with var, which is the keyword, and it has a character x here. Now this x we have here on the first line is actually a variable name, and you can see that we are making use of the single line comments here as a means of describing what we have on that line. So the comment here says declared only. So this actually means that for this first line, we've actually declared the variable name of x. We've not assigned a value to it at all. Now, moving on to the next line, we have another variable name of first name, and it is also declared with the value of var, that's var. But you can see that below it, it actually has the variable name being assigned a value, which is a string of John. So here we can see that we declared the variable on one line, we initialized it on another line. So having it this way is, is okay, is acceptable in JavaScript. And on the last line, where we have the variable name of y, you can see that we both declared and initialized it at once on one line, which is why you have variable y equals to 20. So now the value here is 20. That's for the last line. And you can see that for the previous line, the value there is John. So these two values, they are not of the same data types. They are of different data types, which we'll get to know about in future classes. But for now, just understand that you can actually declare a variable without initializing it. You can also declare and come back to initializing it later on, and you can also declare and initialize at once at the same time. So next we have the let keyword. The let keyword is also among the keywords used for declaring variables in JavaScript, and it has a similar syntax with the var keyword. The only difference here is the keyword itself, which begins with let. So for the first syntax, we have this to be for just declaration only. And the second syntax is actually for declaration and initialization. So they both begin with the let keyword, and we'll be seeing an example of how this would appear. So for this example, we have the let keyword with the variable name of L name. And so this particular first line we have on the screen here is actually going to mean that the L name has been declared only and not initialized. It's just declared. So it's also similar with the var keyword. The only difference here is the keyword. And you can also see that in the second line where we have a variable name of I, that's letter I, it has a value of 15, which means that it was declared and initialized at once on the same line. Also, on the third line, we have a variable name of J. You can see that right here it was declared on one line, and just below it, it was initialized with the value of 20. So it's possible to have it this way, or you could have it the other way at the top where we have it to be declared and initialized. Either ways, they are both acceptable in JavaScript. Also, we have the let f name, which is equals to Jane. For this one, it is declared and initialized too. And we have the last one, which is just let k, just declared only. So here you can see that you can declare it only, you can declare it and initialize it later on, or you can actually declare and initialize at once. So for the third keyword, we have the const keyword. Now the const keyword is also among the keywords used for declaring variables in JavaScript, but this actually declares variables with constant values. So for the constant values, we'll be seeing why it is actually like this when we get to some other sections of today's class. Now, for the syntax in the const keyword, you can see that it is quite different from the let and the var keyword. And this is actually because when using the const keyword, it is always compulsory to add a value to it. So this actually means that if you were to declare it without initializing it, you would have an error. So that's the reason why you have the syntax to begin with the const, which is followed by the variable name and then assign a value. For the const keyword, please note this: you cannot have it declared without a value. It must always be with a value. It cannot exist without a value. So that's how the syntax appears here. And we'll be seeing an example of this in the next slide. So here we have a quick example of we declaring variables making use of the const keyword. And as you can see on the screen, every line of code within the script tags are actually assigned with a value. So like I said before, by not doing this, you would get an error. So for the first line, we have the const keyword with the variable name of name2 to be assigned a string of dough. Also, we have the const keyword in the second line with a variable name of a assigned with the value of 15. Likewise, we have b to be assigned with the value of 20, and we have a variable name of user id to be assigned with the value of 15472. Now, these values can be of different types. So for the sake of simplicity, I just decided to stick with the number type and the string type. So before we leave here, let me quickly say this again. The const keyword must always be declared with a value. It must be declared and initialized at once. You can't declare it and come back to initialize it later on, like the let and the var keyword. It isn't allowed here. So here you must always declare and initialize immediately. So for the last section of this part, we have the nothing. Now here a variable can be declared with nothing attached to it. So this actually is possible in JavaScript and you wouldn't get any error at all. But the truth here is that when you declare a variable name without nothing, it actually takes the default declaration of var. So you can actually say that it is equivalent to adding the var keyword that's at the beginning of that line is equivalent to that. But another thing to also note is that by doing such, the variables would actually be known as undeclared variables. So despite the fact that they have a default value of var, even when they are not declared with any keyword, they're actually still called undeclared variables. And so, like I said, it's not going to give you an error. Your code will still work fine. But by doing so, it's not really advisable to do this. But you just know this, that you can actually declare a variable name with nothing. And also from the syntax, you can see that using nothing to declare a variable name must also have a value. So this is quite similar with the const keyword. It must have a value. You cannot just you can't undeclare and uninitialize a variable name. It doesn't work that way. You get an error. So in as much as you did not declare the variable name, you must always assign a value to that variable name. Yeah, so here we have a quick example of variable names without nothing being used to declare them. As you can see on the first line, we have the variable name of a to be assigned the value of 15. Now the let keyword isn't here, the var keyword isn't here, the const keyword doesn't appear here at all. So running this particular portion of code on VS Code would actually give you results. It wouldn't give you an error. But like I said before, it's not best practice to do this. But just know that it would actually work when you run it on VS Code. And also we have the name to variable name assigned the value of though you have the b to be assigned the value of 20. Now if you notice for the last value you have the last variable name which is c to be assigned with a sum of a and b. That's a sum of the variable name of a and the variable name of b. So what this means basically is that the c value here, when printed on the browser, it would actually have a value of 35, which is a sum of the a variable name and the b variable name, since the a has a value of 15 and the b has a value of 20. Now this particular operation doesn't only apply to this part of this section, which is nothing. It also applies to the var, the const and the let keywords. So we'll be seeing more of this when we get to the practical section of this class. Yeah, so now we are in the section where we get to demonstrate how these variables work using each of these keywords. So now we are back to VS Code and we'll be creating a HTML file and an external JavaScript file for this. So we have our HTML, we'll be making use of the boilerplate. And next we'll create our JavaScript file. So as I said in yesterday's class, you can actually use the JavaScript within the head section or the body section. But for the sake of this, we'd actually be using this in the body section. So here we'd have our script tags. I would also be making use of some HTML elements, most especially the p tag. And the reason why we are doing this is because by default, JavaScript rendering is inline, and we wouldn't want our values to be on one line. So it's always better you have them, separated. We have an ID name of P1, an ID name P2. Here we have an ID name of P3. So now we have three separate paragraphs. So the next thing we'll do is to reference our JavaScript file in this HTML document. By doing this, we'll be making use of the source attributes, and this will be main2.js. So you can see that even before we complete typing, it actually shows us the kind of files we could reference. So the next thing we do is to actually start declaring variables. So we'll go with the var keyword. I would go with man. We'll give this a value of a string type, say virtual tech program. Now the next thing we'll do is that we'll be making use of one of the ways we can display outputs in JavaScript, and this is actually the document dot get elements by ID. We'll be having the p1 dot inner html. Now this is just one of the ways we can do this. There are some other different ways, but this is one very basic way we can use, or we could also make use of the document.write as I explained in yesterday's class. But then I said that it isn't advisable to use the document.write because it's only used for testing purposes. So this will be equals to the variable name of man that we've already declared and initialized here. So let's just add a comment to this. So this has been declared and initialized. So now we'd only be making use of the first paragraph. And if we save this, okay, we're actually using the external JS, so we are not supposed to have the code here. We're going to be having the code in the main 2.js file right here. So now if we should open with live server, we should expect to see the value that has been assigned to the man variable name on the screen. And here we have it, sale virtual tech program. So this particular value has been connected with the p tag because it's the p tag holds an id name which has been used by the javascript method. That's the document dot get element by id. So the next thing we'll be doing here is declaring on one line. We'll call this man2. Remember, the variable name is something you can create on your own, so you can actually create it anyhow you like, but then there are some rules we would get to know about when it comes to creating these variable names. So here we just say variable of man2. Here is declared. So next we'll initialize it on another line. I will call this John Doe. So after doing this, we would also be making use of the method we had before, document.get element by id. And for this, we'll be making use of the second paragraph. So I'm going to uncomment this. And now we'll reference this by the id name we have in the HTML element, which is p2 dot inner html. And since we already have a value for the man2, we just have to reference this by the variable name. So like I said before, to actually, rather than you know assigning this with the value of John Doe, since we already have the John Doe value to be assigned to a variable name, all you need to do is just to reference this by the variable name itself, and you'd actually get the same result on the screen. So now we have John Doe here. So something here to note is that you can also give this a string directly. So we can also have Jane Doe here, and it will also give us a result with this particular value on the browser. So we have Jane Doe now. So the last example here, this is initialized only. Yeah, so before we move on, Another thing to note here is that you do not declare a variable name twice, you only declare it once. So now that we have the variable name of man2 to be declared on this line, we cannot come here and actually put a var man2 again. Actually, it's wrong. Now you might not get an error, but it's not best practice to do that. So it's always best if you declare a variable name on one line, then in the next line you should just initialize straight ahead without having to declare again. So the next example we'll be having would be declaration and initialization on the same line. Here we can use a variable name of laptop, probably give this a string of any laptop out there. And so now we've actually declared and initialized. So for this, we'll be making use of the last p tag. We don't comment this. And for this p tag, we have the ID name of p3. So we'll just copy this. Okay. And we'll reference this by the variable name of laptop. So by doing so, we'll have this HP Elite book within a paragraph on the browser. So here we have this. So now you can see that you can actually declare and initialize the variables using any of these forms. You can declare at once, you can declare and come back to initialize later on. It's actually all dependent on you. So without wasting much of our time, we'll be changing this by making use of the let keyword. So now that we have this here, we'll also change this to the let keyword, and this will also be used with the let keyword. So now we've actually changed all the var keywords to let keyword. But since the var and the let are quite similar, it actually means that we shouldn't expect an error, and we should also get exactly the same results we had before. So if I save this now and I go back to the browser, we actually have everything, you know, remaining the way they were, even with the var keyword. So just to make sure that it really works, let's just add some text to this. We change this to Johnson. I'll be changing this to, we also change this also, JavaScript classes ongoing. Okay, so we didn't make reference with the man2, we change this to man2. So now we are expected to have JavaScript classes going ongoing, Johnson and Dell Latitude on the screen, and they'll be printed in block form since we are making use of the paragraph HTML tags. So here you can see we have this, and they have all been defined using the let keyword. So for the final part of this demo, we'll be making use of the const keyword. Like I said before, the const keyword must always be used when declaring a variable with a value. So now we have declared and initialized. Now we cannot have this const with man2. You can see that for this line it is declared only, and like I said before, for the const keyword you cannot declare only. So you can see we already have an error here, which can be seen with this red wavy marker under the variable name. And if I should hover over it, you can see it. Const, const declarations must be initialized. So this is actually a message from VS Code actually telling you that by making use of the const keyword, you must always initialize the variable name. So for this, would be having this Johnson right here. So now it is not declared only, but it is now declared and initialized. So now we have, okay, we'll also change this to constant too. And now we have all the variable names to begin with the const keyword. And if we save this, they would also print the same result on the screen. We can actually change this to know if it works. For this John, we call this Dell. Yeah, so as you can see, it actually works. So you can see that the let, the var, and the const can actually be used in terms of declaring a variable name. Now, lastly, we would actually be doing this without any keyword. We'll take this out. We'll also take this out, and would also take this out. So for this particular method, it is also said that you must always assign a value to the variable name. So now each variable name here has a value that is being assigned to them. So if we save this, let's actually see what happens on the browser. And you can see that nothing changes. It's still the same. It's still very much the same. You can actually change this HP. You can see that it still renders. Nothing changes here. But then, like I said before, it's not advisable to do this. It's always better you declare it using any of these keywords. And I also said that the var keyword is not really used anymore. So this basically cuts your options of declaring variables from 4 to actually 2, which is by making use of the let keyword and the const keyword. The var isn't really used anymore, and by not declaring it with any keyword is not advisable to do that. So now you basically have two options of declaring, either using the let or the const. But now each of these keywords actually have some differences which we'll get to see later on in today's class. So let's move on. So for the next section, we have JavaScript identifiers and rules for naming variables. So under this section, we'll get to see what an identifier is, and we'll also get to see the rules for naming variables. Now, mind you, you can't just name a variable anyhow you like. There are some specific rules you must follow. Now, for the previous section, we made use of some variable names and I followed the rule, which is why all those things were able to render on the browser. So here we'll be seeing the rules for naming variables. I would also get to know what a JavaScript identifier is. So what is a JavaScript identifier? A JavaScript identifier can be described as a name that is given to a variable, function, object, and arrays. Now you don't need to worry too much about the functions, objects, arrays. We'll talk about them later on in future classes. But one thing we should know here is that the identifier is a name that you also create. And it's actually a fact that the identifier is like the umbrella name for all variable names, all function names, all object names, and all array names. So the variable names we made use of in the previous section are actually under JavaScript identifiers. So they're actually identifiers, and that's why it is actually said to be a name that is given to variables, functions, objects, and arrays. Now, these given names can be used to reference variables, function, and arrays. So we already saw an example of the referencing in the JavaScript section of the previous section. And it can actually be used to reference the name within any section or any part of your JavaScript file. So here we have examples of JavaScript identifiers, and you can see that for the first part of this section, we have the variables, which we already know about since we touched the previous section. So under the variables here, the first name, the name X and name1 are identifiers under the variable scope. So looking at the code block we have here, you can see that the variable names here are obviously first name, L name, X, and name1. So here they actually define with the var keyword, the lets, and the cons, which we already know about now. And you can see that each of these names we have here are variable names, but they are also known as identifiers. So next we have the function scope. Now, we might not really know much about functions, but no need to worry. We'll talk about that in future classes. But for now, if you notice very well, within the script tag, we've actually defined the function using the function keyword, which is the first keyword right here, the function keyword. Next, we have the name of the function, which is my function. So this particular name that we have created and given to this function is also known as an identifier. That's under the function scope. So don't no need to worry about all this. We'll explain this and this later on. But just know that any name given to a function is also an identifier, just like a variable name. Here is the array part of this section. And you can see that within the script tags, the boys and the girls seen in the example are identifiers. So here we have an array name of boys, that's on this line, and on the next line we have an array name of girls. Now you shouldn't worry too much about what an array is. We'll talk about that in future classes. But one thing to know here is that the name given to an array is also an identifier. So here, the boys here have actually been declared with this const keyword, and this is actually an array name, but it's also an identifier. And here also in the next line, we have the girls array name, which is equally an identifier also. So you can see that the word identifier actually cuts across variables, function, and arrays. Any name you create there is an identifier. So for the last part of this section, we have the object, and here the laptop and the car seen in the script tags are identifiers under the object scope. So this is a quick example of what an object looks like, and do not worry about it too much. For the object section, we'll be having that in future classes. But for the sake of explaining identifiers, the object name of laptop and the object name of car here are also identifiers. So this probably means that a variable name, a function name, an array name, an object name, they are all together under the umbrella of identifiers. They are all identifiers just within different scope of JavaScript. So next we have the JavaScript identifier rules. So by the word identifier rules, you would also know that these rules actually apply to variable names. They also apply to array names. They also apply to function names. They also apply to object names. So this actually means that for the variable, the rules for naming a variable is going to be under this rule. The rule for naming a function is going to be under this rule. The rule for naming an array and for naming an object is equally going to be under this rule. So this rule actually governs how you create variable names, function names, array names, and object names. So now, while creating the identifiers, which we already know about, there are certain rules that must be observed. And now for the first rule is the fact that the identifier name must be unique. So this actually means that no two identifier must have the same name. So if you're to have a variable name, it is always best you have unique names when declaring variables. Do not try to repeat the names as they could override each other or it can cause some kind of errors in the code. It's always best to make sure the identifier names are unique. For the next rule, the identifier name must always begin with a letter, either an uppercase letter or a lowercase letter. By that I mean small letters and capital letters. They can also begin with a dollar sign and also an underscore. So for this second rule, whenever you are naming a variable or you are naming a function or an array or an object, you should always begin with either a letter, a dollar sign, or an underscore. You shouldn't begin with a digit. Beginning a variable name with a number is not allowed. So these are the only characters you can use when starting to create when you begin creating a variable name. Either a letter, which could be upper or lowercase, or the dollar sign, or the underscore. Now the third rule here actually states that the identifier name can contain letters which could be upper or lowercase. It could also contain numbers 0 to 9, and it could also contain the dollar sign and the underscore. Now, if you look very well on the screen, you would notice that the rule 2 and the rule 3, they feel like it's the same thing, but it's not the same. For the rule 2, it states clearly what you should begin with. And if you notice very well, in the rule 2, we do not have numbers there. And that's because an identifier name cannot begin with a number. But in the rule 3, you can actually have numbers in between the variable names or the function names. You can have number in between or at the end of the name, but you must never have it at the beginning of that identifier name. Whether it's a variable name or a function name or an array name or an object name, a number must not begin it. So for the fourth rule, JavaScript keywords or reserved words cannot be used as identifiers. So I believe for now we do not know what keywords are, but at the same time we've also gotten to know about three keywords already. That's in previous section of today's class, which is the var keyword, the let keyword, and the const keyword. Now these keywords cannot be used as identifiers. So what this means basically is that you cannot have the var, the let, and the const to be used as a variable name. You can't have it to be used as a function name. You can't also have it being used as an object name or an array name. They are keywords, and because they are keywords, they have a particular purpose they are to fulfill in the JavaScript file. So you can't use them as a variable name. Their purpose has already been defined in JavaScript. So you trying to define it with another purpose of having to, store data or values for you is wrong. It can't work. So we should always take note of this fourth rule. Particularly, you cannot use a keyword as an identifier. It's wrong. It wouldn't work and it would only lead you to errors. Now, for the fifth rule, it actually says that JavaScript identifiers are case sensitive. So, for those that were in the first class, you already understand what case sensitivity actually means. And what this means is that JavaScript renders lowercase and uppercase letters very differently. So you cannot have a word like name and you begin that word with N having a small letter and then another word with name with the N having a capital letter. JavaScript would actually render it differently and not as the same variable names. So we should always take note of this. Exactly the way you declare the uppercase and lowercase letters in your variable names should be exactly the same way you would reference it in another part of the file. You can't change variable names like that. You need to be very, very careful because here JavaScript actually takes case sensitivity very, very seriously. So it's another thing we should know. Now for the rule 6, spaces are not allowed when creating identifiers. Yeah, so I know some of us might be used to, trying to create a space within first. Let's assume we have a variable name like first name. You might be tempted to want to create a space within first and name, or you have a variable like last name. You might want to actually create a kind of space between the last and the name. Now, for JavaScript, it doesn't accept spaces. So what this means is that all the characters within the variable name must be put together. So if we were to have first name as a variable name, you would actually have it to be first name without a space in between. Also last name, also username. Now for the final rule, hyphens are also not allowed when creating identifiers. Now I think as a substitute for the hyphens, it's always better to use the underscore. But note this, hyphens are not allowed. And this is because JavaScript actually renders the hyphen symbol as subtraction, that's minus sign. So if you were to have first name and you put a hyphen between the first and the name, to you who declared it, you might think you have it to be first name. But to JavaScript, you actually have that to be first minus name. So if probably in your program you had declared the variable of first with a value and you had name with another value, that would actually evaluate to give you a value rather than just the first name. So it's always better not to use an hyphen when creating a variable name or a function name or an array name or an object name. Rather, you should make use of the underscore since that is what JavaScript accepts when creating variable names. So here we have an example of identifiers, and you can see that for this example we have two sections. For the first section we have valid identifiers. Now these valid identifiers are identifiers that actually followed the rules for declaring these identifiers. But for the invalid identifiers, they are the ones that did not follow the entire rule. They probably followed some and did not, follow some. So what this means is that for JavaScript, you must follow the entire rule. That's from the rule 1 to rule 7. You cannot follow 6 out of 7 or 5 out of 7 or 4 out of 7. You don't get to choose what to follow. You must follow all. So looking at the first example here, it has first name and we follow the rule here. It begins with an uppercase letter, lowercase, and there's no space in between the first name. For the next one, we have first name 34. So like I said before, JavaScript identifiers cannot begin with digits. So having this digit at the end here is very valid. Also, I made mention that you can begin the identifier name with an underscore. So underscore username is actually correct. Also, we can also begin with the dollar sign. So here we have dollar sign first underscore name. This is a very, very valid identifier. Next, we have last underscore name, very valid too. We also have on we also have the dollar sign user underscore name 100, very valid also, in as much as it doesn't begin with the digits of 100 here, is valid. Next, we have underscore laptop, also valid too, since it begins with the underscore and there are no spaces, and it just follows the rules. Lastly, we have dollar sign laptop 01, also follows the rules of declaring identifiers. So here all the valid identifiers follow the complete rule that we've stated before. So without wasting time, let's look at the invalid identifiers. These ones are the wrong ones, the ones that you should never use, you should never make use of, you should never try declaring your identifier names like this. For the first one, we have one. This is actually first name, but here we have number one beginning the identifier name. This is wrong. Next, we have first name. Now, this looks kind of okay or kind of correct, but here we have a space in between the first and the name. And as I said before, spaces are not allowed. So to correct this, you would actually push the two of them together and not have a space here. This is wrong. Next, we have first hyphen name, another wrong identifier. The hyphen is not allowed. Next, we have the dollar sign last hyphen name. Because of the hyphen, it is not allowed, despite the fact that it begins with the dollar sign, which actually makes it look valid. It has the hyphen here, invalid, unacceptable. Next, we have the underscore user hyphen name, also invalid. JavaScript will not accept this. You can see for the next one we have 54 underscore user. This 54 here makes the entire identifier name invalid. So by removing this 54, it becomes valid, but having it here makes it invalid. For the last, we have var and const, which we already know to be keywords for declaring variables. As I said before, using keywords as identifier names is also invalid, is wrong. So I hope we were able to, take note of the valid identifiers. Now, these valid identifiers are not limited to this. Since it's something that we create on our own, there are actually a lot out there, a lot.
Please,
But
you did not include the let.
also the let is an invalid identifier also. Yes, so the let, the var, the const, in fact, any keyword in JavaScript is an invalid identifier. You cannot use it as an identifier name. So I hope we're able to understand how to create this valid and these valid identifiers, because we'll be making use of these ones here. That's the valid identifiers rather than this. So you would never actually want to do all these things we have under the invalid identifiers. So for this section, you know what we'll do here? We'll actually go on VS Code and try out these identifiers and see what really happens. So we are back to, our VS Code, and without wasting much of our time, we'll be changing these identifiers by following the rule. So here we'll have this to be first name. We should also change this to first name. Let's just make use of one one of them. If we save this and go back to our browser, you can see we have the JS here, and this is actually rendered because we used a correct variable name. Also, if we should add a dollar sign here, it makes it valid. So we'll add it here also. We'll probably change the value of this HTML and JS. So here we have HTML and JS. So this is actually proof that we actually follow the rule when it comes to declaring the variable names. So I hope we already know now we should know that the variable name is also an identifier. And lastly, we can have this to begin with the underscore. It could also yield the same results. Yeah, so you can see we made use of the rules when it comes to declaring our variable names. I mean creating our variable names. So now we'll be making use of some invalid variable names. If we should add a 9 here, you can see that immediately it displays an error with this red marker below the variable name. And you can see it already says so. An identifier or keyword cannot immediately follow a number, a numeric literal. So what this means is that we cannot have this number beginning a variable name. Also, we cannot have the first hyphen name. You can see now it gives us an error. It says is void. You can't have this too. So you can see that the moment we get an error, the color here actually changes to red, and you'd see a red marker under the variable name. So if we should also have a space here, first with a space of name, immediately you have this red marker here, which shows that there's an error in this file. So this is not accepted. It's not also not accepted. With the number is not accepted. Even when you start with the underscore, you have the minus here, it's not accepted. You can have the dollar sign here, it's still not accepted because of this hyphen. Until you actually change this to the underscore, now this is accepted. So I think for most cases you might want to make use of the underscore rather than the hyphen, because the hyphen is unacceptable. Also, let's look at trying to try and make use of the keywords. So we'll say let var equals to this. You can see that this even causes a huge error to the value. So you can see this is equally not allowed. You cannot have let not allowed to, gives you an error. You can also not have let const. So any keyword that we have out there cannot be used as a variable name or as an identifier. 54 ty not allowed. Ty space rt not allowed. So for this, I'll be making use of the dollar sign name underscore user. Change this text to Jindo. We save this and we go back here. We have Jindo. So here you can see our variable name follows the rule. So we do not get any error and we actually get the results we want. Now, as I said before, the variable names are case sensitive. Here we have the n here to be in lowercase. If we had it here to be in uppercase, you can see there's a difference here and here. Here the dollar sign name underscore user begins with N in lowercase. Here we have it to be in uppercase. If we save this, the screen is blank. So this is why I said that the identifiers are case sensitive. And this case sensitivity actually affects the entire identifier name. So even if we have this to be lowercase of n, and we had, let's say, the s here to be in uppercase, it would also give us an error. There's nothing here. So you must use it the exact way you actually created it. It must not be different. Okay, we've not saved this. See, now we have Jane Doe. Now let's try repeating the variable name. So we'll have this name user. So like I said before, the variable name has to be unique. Okay. Oh, so here we'd have let $name underscore user. You can see that now we are making use of a variable name that exists already. So we'll be giving this a different value. Let's call this JS classes. You can see that even before I could continue, it already highlights this to be
Sir,
an
we
error.
can't see your screen, sir.
Oh, so like I said before, for the variable name, you you cannot use variable name more than once. So you cannot actually have a variable name being repeated. It's always better to use a unique name. So here we already have $name underscore user right here. If we try to have it here again, you can see that it gives us an error even before we assign a value to it. So it's always better for you to have a unique variable name. So for this, we'll be taking out the $, and this will just be name underscore user. So now you can see that an error isn't shown here, and that's because here we have the $, and here we do not have the $. So these two variable names are not the same, they are different. I will give this John Doe. So here we have the $, not the $, the name underscore user. So saving this, we have Jane Doe and John Doe on the screen. So you should always be careful when creating variable names. You should always follow the 7 rules that have been stated, which we already know about. Do not try creating the variable names with numbers. Always make sure your variable names are unique, which means you have different variable names. There's no variable name that is being repeated. It's always better you have unique variable names. And of course, the rest of the rules should be followed. No spaces in variable names, no hyphens in variable names. You do not begin with a number. The variable name must be very unique. So for this third section, we have JavaScript and camel case. So here we'll be seeing what the camel case actually is, and we'll be getting to know more about it and how it affects JavaScript. So what is camel case? Camel case is one of the styles used by JavaScript programmers when creating a variable name. So what this means is that the camel case is actually a style you apply when you are trying to create a variable name. Now we already know how a variable name looks like, and we also know the rules you should follow when creating a variable name. But now we are going to see a style or pattern of how we can create a variable name. And as such, in camel case, multiple words are joined together to form a variable name. So the camel case here is just a pattern of creating the name. And for this pattern, you would have multiple words being joined together to form this variable name. So here we have the camel case usage. So in this section, we'll be explaining how to use the camel case pattern when you are trying to create a variable name. So applying the camel case when creating a variable names would require that we take note of the following. So the first thing we should take note of is that the first word is entirely in lowercase, which means they are all small letters in the first word. Remember that camel case actually is used to style a variable name by adding multiple words together. So now, depending on how many words you're actually putting out to actually create this variable name, you might probably have 2 words, 3 words, 4 words, 5 words, and above. You should always note that the very first word would be in small letters or it will be in lowercase entirely. Now, the first letter of the second word is going to be in uppercase and the rest are going to be in lowercase. So what this means is that if, for instance, we are to create a variable using the camel case pattern, and let's assume this variable is going to have 2 words, it actually means that the very first word will be in lowercase completely, and the second word will only have the very first letter to be in uppercase. Now, for the final rule we are to follow, other words that would follow after that second word would actually conform to rule 2. So what this means is that if you were to have a 3-word variable name or a 4-word variable name or a 5-word, 6-word and above, any other word after the second word would follow the rule of the second word, which is that the first letter of that word would only be in uppercase with the rest being in lowercase. So we'll be seeing an example of that in the next slide. So here we have an example of variable names that actually follow the camel case pattern. And as you can see for the first example, it actually has two words here, which is first and name. Already we know that as a rule in creating variable names, a space cannot be in between. And you can see that for the first word, which is first, the entire letters here are in lowercase. But for the second word, which is name, the N here is the only uppercase letter, the rest are in lowercase. So this is exactly how the camel case um, pattern actually works. Also, you can see that the last name also follows the same pattern. The entire word here is in lowercase, but the first letter of the second word is in uppercase. Now, for the third example, we have 3 words, which is the first, user, and address. So this is actually first user address. But you can see that the first here has the entire words, that's the entire letters to be in lowercase. But for the second word, the first letter is in uppercase, which is the U. And also for the address, which is the third word, the A here is in uppercase. So this is how you are going to have it for multiple words that would follow. So as more words keep coming in this variable name, you would actually be making the very first letter of the word to be in uppercase and the rest in lowercase. So this particular rule also applies to the next example, which is my house number. You can see the M and the Y, they are in lowercase as a word. For this second word, which is house, the H here is in uppercase. And for the last word, which is number, the N is the only uppercase letter, the rest will be in lowercase. So that rule also applies to last user address. You can see that we followed the camel case pattern. Also, we follow the pattern in my MasterCard. and we also follow the same pattern in my user location and also in user ID. So that's how you make use of the camel case pattern when it comes to creating your variable names. So for this section, we'll also be seeing some other types of casing, which we have to be the Pascal case and the snake case. Now, the reason why we took our time to talk about the camel case is actually because in JavaScript, the camel case is mostly used by JavaScript programmers. So for we that are learning the JavaScript, we would always be making use of the camel case rather than the Pascal case. So here the Pascal case, you can see an example of this. It's quite similar to the camel case. The only difference here is that every word first letter would have their first letter to begin with in uppercase. So you can see in the example of first name, the F, which is the first word, is in uppercase, and the name, which is the second word, has its first letter in uppercase. It also applies to the last name and also to my car number. So the Pascal case and the camel case are quite similar. Only difference is that in the camel case, the very first word are in lowercase, but for the Pascal case, every word has its first letter to be in uppercase. Also, for the snake case, is quite different from the Pascal and the camel, but it also follows the rule of declaring variables, which is actually by making use of this underscore. So here you have first underscore name, last underscore name, that's in uppercase, and you have last underscore name in lowercase. So this particular casing uses the underscore to separate the words rather than having them combined together as one word. So for those that would like to, separate the words from each other, spaces and hyphen are not allowed. But here you can use the snake case. So the snake case will be the best attempt, will be the best method to use here if you really like separating the words of your variable names together. But for the sake of JavaScript, JavaScript is mostly used with the camel case, you know. But then you can see that we also have other cases you can make use of, and they would also work in JavaScript. So for the final section of today's class, here we'll be looking at how the let, var, and the const keywords actually work within different concepts. Because as we saw earlier, when we touched the let, var, and const keyword, we saw that they were quite similar and it almost looks like they could do the same things. But here we'll be looking at them under some concepts, and you'd actually see the differences between each of these keywords. It's best to understand how the let, var, and const keyword work within this concept. So here we'll be seeing some basic concepts, and the first concept here is the scope concept. Also, we'll be looking at the reassigning a new value concept too, because one thing to know is that even after declaring and initializing a variable using the var and the let keyword, you can always reassign it with a new value. But with the const, it's not possible. So we'd also get to know about that in this section. So for the first section, we have the scope. What is the scope? The scope in JavaScript is a way to define where and if we can use a variable. So throughout the demo we've been doing in the previous sections of today's class, we've actually been making use of the global scope, which is why what we've been printing out actually works, anywhere. But now we'll actually be defining where we want a particular variable to work and not just work in the entire JavaScript file. So under the scope, there are mainly three types of scope. We have the block scope, we have the functional scope, and we have the global scope. So for the first scope, we have the block scope. Now, the block scope makes use of a block, which is a portion of code defined within a pair of curly braces. So for the block scope, you would actually define a pair of curly braces, and within these braces, you would have your blocks of code. Now, something to note here is that in the block scope, variables declared with the let and the const cannot be accessed outside the block. So what this means is that any variable that is declared with the let keyword or with the const keyword within the block cannot be accessed outside. And that's actually a good thing. Now, the good thing about this is in a situation whereby you want to define a variable within a part or a portion of your JavaScript file, and you don't want that variable to be accessible outside that particular part. Now, making use of the block scope by using the let and the const keyword in declaring the variable is good. But if you should make use of the var keyword while declaring a variable within the block scope, the variable would still be, able to be accessed outside. So what this means is that the let and the const variables, when defined within a block scope, cannot be accessed outside the block scope. But when declared with a var, it can be accessed inside and outside. And why doing so with the var will not be good is in the case where you already have a variable name that exists globally out there. Now, if you should create another variable within the block scope using var, it would actually override the one outside. And so if you are trying to print out the one already declared out there, you wouldn't get that. You would only get the one within the block scope. Okay, so this is actually a quick example that I'll be having on VS Code very soon. But just for simplicity, you can see that we've already defined the block here, and that's by beginning with these curly braces we have here and here. So in between these curly braces are these variables that we have declared. We declared the man variable using the var keyword, assign the value of John Doe. We also declared the y variable with the let keyword, which has the value of 53. Also, we have the variable name of x, which has been declared with the const keyword with the value of SailTech. Now, you can see that we've actually tried to print this outside this entire scope here and not within the block. So, printing out the very first variable name of man, because it has been declared with the var keyword, it would actually display the name John Doe, it is actually despite the fact that it was declared within a block. But for the let and the const, you would actually have what we call a reference error. So using the let and the const within a block, they cannot be referenced outside that block, but only inside the block. And so it would not be very advisable to use the var, keyword to declare a variable within a scope, because like I said before, let's assume we have this man variable name here declared somewhere outside this block. That man variable right there would be a global variable. But the moment you actually declare it again within a scope, it would actually conflict with the one outside, and it will give you this value of John Doe instead of giving you the value you have out there for the other variable being declared. So no need to worry, we'll actually see how this works in VS Code. Next, we have the functional scope. Now, this scope makes use of a function, and a function is a portion of code defined within a pair of curly braces. Now, we wouldn't be talking too much about functions, but then we'll be seeing functions in future classes, but for the sake of explaining the functional scope, the functional scope actually makes use of functions. And so the functions also make use of, the curly braces, and it also has a function name, which we already know to be an identifier. Now, something to note here is that in the functional scope, variables declared with var, let, and const keywords cannot be accessed outside the block but only within. So this actually means that even the var keyword cannot be accessed outside in as much as you have defined them within a function. So for a quick example, you can see that we have a function here which begins with this function keyword. Then we have a function name which is the my func. Yeah, something very very short. And you can see that within this function we have the variable of man with the value of John Doe. We have the variable of y, which has been declared with the let keyword holding the same value of 53, and likewise x with the value of sale virtual. Now trying to reference these variable names outside the function will give each of them an error. All of them will have an error. So it's always best practice to use the functional scope when you want to define a particular variable that you don't want to be accessed outside the that's you don't want it to be accessed outside the function. So here it is quite similar with the block scope. The only difference now is how it affects the var keyword. So you can see that in the block scope, the way it affects the let and the const is also the same with the functional scope. But for the var keyword, in the functional scope, it cannot be accessed, but in the block scope, it can actually be accessed outside. So for the last part of this section, we have the global scope. Now, many of you might not know this, but the global scope is actually the scope we've been working with throughout the practical session we've had today in today's class. So the global scope only affects variables declared with let, var, and const outside a block or a function. So for most practical demos we've done today, you can see that we never had a variable name within a block or within a function. So throughout the practical session we've been having today, we've actually been working with the global scope, which is why you just create a variable. You can always print it anywhere on the file. So another thing, that's also another thing to note here. The variables declared here can be accessed anywhere in the JavaScript program. So here we have, you know, a quick example of how the global scope works. So you can see that we have the function here, and we've actually declared these variables outside this function. So this example is also the same with the example we had in the functional and the block scope. The only difference here is that we've actually declared each of these variables outside a function, and you can see that within the function we are calling these variable names, and they would actually display results for us. So even if you have this within a block, you know, a block section in your code, it will also display the same result. So here we have reassigning a new value. Now in JavaScript, variables declared with the var and let keyword can be reassigned with a new value even after the initial declaration and initialization. So this actually means that if you should declare a variable using the let and the var keyword with an actual value, you can always change that value to something else anytime you want. And you can also change the value to a different type, and that's because JavaScript is a loosely typed language. So that actually means that the data type of the value you have assigned the first time, it isn't tied to that variable name. The variable name can always accept any other type of value. But here we can see that variables declared with the const keyword cannot be reassigned with a new value. That was why I said in the definition of the const keyword that the const keyword is used for declaring variables with constant values. So what this means is that the values cannot change. The moment you've declared it like that, and that's how it's going to be forever in your program. So for a quick example of this, you can see we also have the same examples we had before. The man keyword, the man variable name, the y variable name, and the x variable name. And for the man variable name, it's been declared with the var keyword. The y is declared with the let keyword, and the x is declared with the const keyword. Now you can see that for the man variable name, we've actually assigned it a value of John Doe, which is of a string type, but we've also re-initialized it again with a value of Peter. And this would actually display Peter rather than John Doe. And that's because variables declared with the var keyword can actually accept a new value. And also the let keyword was initialized with a number 53, but here we've reassigned the y variable name a string value of laptop. Despite the fact that the 53 is a number type and the laptop is of a string type, which means there are two different types, it would actually still work. So that was why I said the JavaScript is a loosely typed language. The the data types of the values are not tied to the variable names. The variable names can always accept any new value with any new data type. But for the const keyword has been initialized with the value of sale tech. Now trying to change it to virtual, it would give us an error, and that's because this isn't allowed in JavaScript. So for this section, we'd actually be looking at the camel case, the JavaScript keywords concepts, and also the scopes that we talked about in JavaScript. So back to our VS Code, we wouldn't be wasting much of our time. We'll just be applying the camel case into these variable names. And so for this would actually be user name. This one could actually be name user. We also have multiple of them, address, place. And you can see that each of these words are actually they're actually on their own now. And you can see for the first word, you have it to be in lowercase letters completely. But for the second word, you have the first letter to be in uppercase. Also for this word, the first letter is in uppercase, and the first letter here is also in uppercase. So you would have to join them together by following the rule of creating a variable, and you have this. So this is actually how you make use of the camel casing. Now for the Pascal casing, all you need to do is to make sure the first word has its first name, has its first letter in capital. So now we've made use of the Pascal casing for this. So this is how the Pascal casing actually is. So we'll be changing this back to the camel case, which has the entire first word to be in lowercase. Also for the snake case, you'll be making use of the underscore between each word. So this is actually camel case and snake case combined. So let's just make this fully snake case by having all lowercase letters. So here we have a fully snake case defined variable. So like I said in JavaScript, you would only be making use of the camel case mostly. Okay, Without wasting time, let's quickly look at the scope. And for the first scope, we have the block scope, which begins with the curly braces we can see on the screen. In here, we'll declare the first variable name with the var keyword. Call this name underscore user. If name underscore user already exists, I'll just call it dollar sign user one. We assign this a string. Next, we'll be using the let keyword with dollar sign user two. Another string also. And lastly, we'll use the const keyword dollar sign user three. So now you can see that in the VS Code, the user one is in a lighter bluish color than this and this. And so let's try printing it out using the document.write. So like I said before, this document.write is just for testing purposes. It's not what you'll be making use of. Or we should actually use the document.get element by ID. So this will be dollar sign user one, user two, user three. So now we should expect that everything would appear on the browser, but at the end of the day, you'd only get to see just one value out of these three values, and that value should be James. So you can see we only have the value of James on the screen. So that was why I said when you want to declare a particular variable and you don't want it to be accessed outside, you shouldn't use the var keyword for that. Rather, you should use the let and the const. So let's actually have this within our block. If we were to have it within the block, this would actually print out. So now we have all three values, and that's because we reference them within the same block where they were defined. So that's how the block scope actually affects the var, the let, and the const keyword. So we'll be converting this block to a function without wasting much time. First, we'll be adding the function keyword. Then we'll give it this a function name, any name we want. Now we have our function. We'll be calling this by the function name because that's how you reference a function in JavaScript. You'll always call it by the function name with the normal bracket. So now saving this would actually have the same result on the screen, which is this. And that's because we've actually called them within the same function where they were defined and declared. But now if we should take this out of the function, take them out here and save, now we do not have them anywhere on the screen. And like I said before, this would actually give you a type of error. Despite the fact that we can't see an error in VS Code, we actually have an error in the console part of our browser. So for us to, check that out, we'll go back to the browser. When you right click on the browser window, you have this inspect section here. You click on this and you go here, you can see the console is among the list of items here. You can see uncaught reference error, user one is not defined. So that's actually what happens when you try to reference a variable created in a function outside the function. So lastly, we'll be seeing the global scope, which we are already used to, and that will basically mean we'd have this outside the function somewhere here. And even when we have this particular output within a function and within a scope, within the function and within the block scope, now we have the output within this function and also within this block here. So if we save this, you would see, you can see we have James, Mary, and Mason. So we have everything here. So let's comment this out. I think they're actually overriding each other. That's why we can't see them separately. So if you have this, now we have it within a block scope like this. If you go back here, it still remains here, despite the fact that they were not declared within that block. Also, if we comment this and we uncomment this one, we also still have it here, still here. So now you know that with the block scope, you can actually reference a variable name even within a function and within a block. So the last thing we'll be checking out is the reassigning of a new value. So the var, the let, and the const already have a value they've been initialized with. So for the user one, we'll be changing the value to something else. For this tech specialist. For the user two, we'll also change the value. We just call this HP specialist, HP partner. And for the user 3, which has been defined using the const keyword, we'll also change the value it has been assigned to, something else. Your partner. Now, if we save this, you would actually see tech specialist and HP partner to actually display for user $ user one and $ user two. But for the user three, okay, nothing is actually displayed. Okay, that's because we've not called them. We'll be calling them outside the function now. Okay. Okay, so I guess this user 3 is causing something. Okay, so it actually shows now. So we have tech specialist and HP partner. Okay, this missing is probably a particular JavaScript code that has overridden the one for the constant. Okay, here we have them. So you can see that the for the dollar sign user one it has changed, and for the dollar sign user two it has also changed. So I'm guessing the reason why this didn't work was because we tried to change the constant. So let me try giving the constant one with the constant a new value AB. Okay, so you can see now that trying to change the constant value can actually cause you errors for even the ones that appear to be correct. So this is one of the reasons why it is always advisable not to change any value that has been declared with the constant. So you can see now that it got us into trouble, and this first two that we've actually changed could not appear on the screen. And like I said before, you can also change this to a different type entirely. So you can have this to be a number type, and also another number type. For the sake of this, we'd actually be taking this out so it doesn't cause us any issue. So here we have 45 and 2001. And we still have missing because this missing here is the value we had declared for the constant already. That's why you still have this appearing here. So I guess with this, that is all for today's class. Thank you, and hopefully we'll have future classes where we'll talk more about these functions that we've seen today.